If you're a really big comic book reader slash collector, I hope that you realize that there are hundreds of trees being murdered because of you on a yearly basis. And for what? Just so you can look at this? And this, you weirdo? You're lucky we don't live in the Lord of the Rings universe. Otherwise, these guys would absolutely beat the living shit out of you. I hope that you're very proud of yourself and you realize that that thing you're holding in your hand right now is nothing more than just a freshly murdered tree. Having said all of that, kick back, relax. We actually have another top 5 comic book list coming at you guys. We're going to be looking at the top 5 comic book symbiotes of all time. Please keep in mind that obviously personal preference is going to be a huge factor involved, but also we will factor in overall strength, how well their stories have been written, and just overall their popularity in the comic book community. Let me know in the comment section if you disagree with the list, what are your top 5s, or what particular symbiote I missed. This list was actually pretty difficult only because we saw quite a few different events taking place involving the symbiotes, primarily the King in Black and the Absolute Carnage run, which introduced us or brought some of these symbiotes back into the spotlight. So let's get straight into it with number 5. We're going to start off with definitely one of the newer additions to the symbiote universe. We're talking Toxin, who made his first appearance in Venom vs. Carnage number 2 all the way back in 2004. Clayton Crane was actually a co-creator of the character as well. Try not to dive too deep into it or think too much about it, but yes, this is technically Carnage's spawn. The symbiote eventually ends up bonding with its first host, Patrick Mulligan, who is actually a police officer for the most part. While Toxin was with Patrick, they were considered relatively good characters or heroes. They went around capturing villains for the most part. Eventually, within that same storyline, Patrick Mulligan ends up dying, and the symbiote decides to join with Brent Waters, who is just a teenager. For the most part, he's a very underused character. He was very lightly referenced during the Absolute Carnage and the King in Black series, which was some of the bigger events happening in the Marvel universe that involved the symbiote community as well. But I personally think this symbiote deserves to be on the list primarily because he's been able to hold his own against Carnage and Venom, who are technically its father and grandfather. And I do believe that this is one of those symbiotes that has, as I mentioned before, been massively underused. But I think that the symbiote itself has a ton of potential, and don't be surprised to see him have a bigger role within the Marvel comic book universe. Next up on the list for number 4, we actually have Carnage, the father of Toxin. His first appearance has a little bit of controversy attached to it. It just depends on your perspective. There are people out there that believe his first appearance is technically in Amazing Spider-Man 359 all the way back in 92, but then there are those that believe that his first full appearance is in Amazing Spider-Man 361. So it's just a matter of perspective. 359 officially is considered his cameo, and 361 is his first full appearance. Mark Bagley was actually the genius behind the design for Carnage. Carnage is actually the spawn of Venom, who actually gives birth to him in prison, where Cletus Cassidy actually runs into him, a very well-known serial killer. And of course, why not? Why wouldn't he join a serial killer? The symbiote could have ended up joining a nun or something along those lines. Just saying, Marvel. Carnage ended up playing a huge, massive role in the most recent symbiote run with Absolute Carnage, where he basically comes back to life and tries to bring Null back as well, who is the longtime king of the symbiotes, at least in that specific time frame. Venom actually ends up taking him out with a Necro Sword. However, as we know in the comic book universe, most characters don't last dead very long, so I'm sure we will see Carnage come back in the comic book universe in no time. Our third spot has to go to Grendel, who was created by Null, who had his first official appearance in Venom number 1 all the way back in the 2018 Donny Cates run. For those who are looking to get into the Venom comic book universe, I think that is a great jumping on point. Start off by reading the highly critically acclaimed Donny Cates' entire Venom storyline. This character also has a little bit of controversy surrounding it because there was an earlier appearance in the 70s where it was basically the same creature. However, it was unnamed at the time, and so there, like I mentioned, there is a certain part of the community that doesn't really accept that as his full appearance. technically, officially, it's considered the Venom number one from the 2018 run. His stint in the DC comic book universe was actually very short-lived. He would go on to perish in Venom number 6 only about a month after his initial first release. Although he did make quite a few spin-off appearances within the comic book universe around that time. In terms of the Venom run, his lifespan was very short-lived, even though he was basically going around wreaking havoc for billions of years historically, but in terms of the comic book existence, it was very short-lived. And honestly, I think the most important fact was completely lost, and that is my fault. I should have started off by saying this is a symbiote dragon. No, do not adjust your speakers, do not adjust your headphones. You heard that correctly. This is a symbiotic dragon who goes around, as I mentioned before, and has gone around for billions of years since the existence of the universe, just wreaking havoc. The biggest reason that he's on the list primarily is just because some symbiotes have certain weaknesses. This particular big, gigantic monstrosity is actually able to withstand some firepower from the army, which in most cases would be able to defeat or would be the biggest weakness for most symbiotes within the Marvel comic book universe. On top of that, he was able to go at and hold his own against the big core of the DC comic book run at that time, which was Venom, Spider-Man, and obviously Miles. At a certain point, he actually ends up trying to swallow Miles Morales whole, which proves to be a really bad idea. Eventually, he gets destroyed and wrecked by the Tyrannosaurus symbiote in certain universes. Yes, he is a gigantic dinosaur. He basically ends up burning Grendel alive, which ends the villain storyline. However, he was incredibly memorable. He was a big, gigantic part of, Null's takeover on planet Earth. So I definitely feel like he deserved a spot on the list. On top of that, he was incredibly powerful, and as I mentioned before, was able to hold his own against some of the big mainstays in the Marvel comic book universe. Number 2 was a really tough spot. He could have easily been number 1 because of how powerful he is. But unfortunately, his time in the Marvel comic book universe was incredibly short. His first appearance was in Venom number 3 all the way back in 2018, and his last appearance, or his final appearance, was in King in Black number 5 in 2021. So even though he was alive for millions and millions of years, and he is considered, or was considered, the god / king of the symbiotes, he was only recently introduced by Donny Cates, and his first appearance is actually massively sought after. He is one of those characters that has a bunch of potential for the future. There have been some rumors that potentially we could see him in the MCU in the next few years, or maybe the next phase for the MCU. We just don't know yet. Even though Kang has already been confirmed as being the next big villain, I could easily see them introducing Null. His history in the comic books is actually incredibly fascinating. He's had some run-ins with Thor, as well as Silver Surfer, and even decapitated a Celestial. Eventually, he finds out that he's able to create the symbiotes. However, in one of those big iconic battles, he ends up losing control of the symbiotes, and they end up trapping him in the core of the Throne World, where he is eventually freed by a former entry into the list, Carnage. As I mentioned before, one of the most iconic runs from Donny Cates was that entire Venom, Absolute Carnage, and the King in Black run. So if you're really interested in finding out a little bit more about Null, you can always pick those comic books up. He actually ends up taking over planet Earth. He defeats quite a few superheroes. We're introduced to Dylan Brock, who is Eddie Brock's son and has some of the same powers that his father has. Null eventually has a run-in with Dylan Brock and then Thor as well. He ends up getting weakened enough, and obviously Venom comes in, which is by now he comes back from the dead. He has basically cosmic level powers. He uses Thor's hammer and Silver Surfer's surfboard, which have now combined into a battle axe. Eventually he ends up basically using the power of the sun's core to obliterate him into non-existence. But as I have mentioned with these lists, this is the comic book universe. The chances of Null returning in the foreseeable future is definitely a very strong and powerful one. especially because his lore is extremely extensive. It goes way back, or I could easily see some sort of spin-offs, maybe telling the story of his beginning or things of that nature. So that is our number 2 spot. Let's jump straight into number 1, and as you guys probably have already guessed, it is none other than Venom, and we're going to stick to the Eddie Brock version because Venom has been known to join up with other big-time Marvel characters, whether it was in this universe or alternate universes. Most notably, the first character that he ever joined up with was with Spider-Man during the Secret War storyline. As is usually the case with the first appearance of Marvel characters, this one is a little bit up in the air. It's not written in stone. There are diehards who believe that the first appearance is an Amazing Spider-Man 252 all the way back in 1984. However, other hardcore fans will tell you that his first true appearance is Amazing Spider-Man 299 all the way back in 1987, which is a whole 3 years later from the 252 Amazing Spider-Man run. Originally, he started off as somewhat of a villain, but eventually became kind of an anti-hero, all the way to rounding out as a absolute superhero. We already mentioned a little bit of the King in Black and Absolute Carnage run, but he not only ends up killing Carnage, but also Null, which is one of the more powerful beings. This is a guy that was going around chopping up Celestials into little pieces. So for Null to go at him, and obviously he did use a lot of help. He used basically an entire Marvel army composed of superheroes, primarily Thor being a big, huge component of that, and eventually he ended up using, as I mentioned previously in the videos, Silver Surfer's surfer board as well as Thor's hammer to defeat Null and eventually basically become the god or the king of the symbiotes himself. All in all, definitely one of the more powerful symbiotes out there, but not only that, he is the most recognizable one. So there is our list. If you guys are interested in some reading material revolving the symbiotes, I would highly suggest, as I already mentioned, King in Black, Absolute Carnage. You also have Separation Anxiety, which talks a lot about the Life Foundation and kind of a little bit of an origin story of the entire little core featuring Lasher, Scream, and the rest of that cast. Other great symbiotes that just barely missed the list. You also have the 2004 series Venom vs. Carnage, which was another great little run, which gave us the first appearance of Toxin. And don't forget Lethal Protector as well, which was another fantastic run from Mark Bagley. But there you guys have it. That is our list. Let me know in the comment section if I missed any symbiote or if I got the list wrong. Let me know in the comment section. I'm very curious to see what you guys have to say. Hit the like button, subscribe, all that good stuff. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you.